Hello, my name is Alexis Eldridge, and I'm going to be taking you through my personal philosophical framework for teaching, and more specifically, how and why I choose to implement cross curricular or interdisciplinary teaching and assessment as part of my practice. To start off, I would say that my teaching identity is one based in equity as demonstrated through inclusion, social justice, and an understanding of educational psychology and behaviorism as it relates to classroom management. So, the expectation is that regardless of where I end up teaching in the future, I can expect my classes to be diverse, whether that be in terms of race, ethnicity, language, socioeconomics, learning needs, abilities, etc. It is therefore my intention to utilize the principles of UDL, or Universal Design for Learning, to ensure equitable education in which my future students will have access to multiple means of acquiring and demonstrating knowledge. My philosophy with regards to how I plan to embody these educational principles and frameworks surrounding equity has evolved and developed over the course of my studies, but I feel confident at this point in my ability to explicitly state my philosophy in terms of how I believe it will relate to my future career. I plan to be an equitable educator with a determined focus on providing all necessary scaffolding, accommodation, and modification for students who may require it for whatever reason, while also acknowledging that all students require and deserve differentiated instruction regardless of legal classification, so as to be on a quote unquote level playing field with their peers. I plan to have students take an active role in their own education rather than simply becoming receptacles for content, in the belief that students who are given opportunities of self determination are more likely to be invested in their education, less frustrated, and consequently more successful in all areas of cognitive development. The educational theorists that largely inform my philosophy are undoubtedly Lev Vygotsky and B.F. Skinner. While such notable names as Piaget and Dewey have informed elements of my identity as a teacher, particularly with regards to self determination and experiential learning, it's the theories of Vygotsky and Skinner that inform my understanding of social justice, equity, differentiated instruction, and classroom management. Vygotsky's ideas regarding scaffolding are a tenet of equitable instruction, with the idea being to recognize that different students will require different scaffolds or levels of support to reach their full potential. The concept of a zone of proximal development has also been crucial to my understanding of survey level assessment and determining individual students' instructional, frustrational, and mastery levels, and thus informing appropriate scaffolds and interventions. Also instrumental has been Vygotsky's sociocultural theory as it relates to culture and the social aspect of learning. In a piece for the English Journal, Peter Smagorinsky writes, Vygotsky's key insight is that thinking is social in origin, and that people often assume that their cultural ways of knowing and acting are the norm, or the essence of human nature itself. They often judge people who have developed other ways of thinking through their immersion in a different culture as having lower character, as being poorly behaved, as being behind in their social evolution, in short, as being lesser people. This is crucial to understand in terms of inclusion and social justice, as statistically it has been shown that students are often punished or misevaluated due to performance or behavior often related to certain cultural norms. This can be seen most clearly with the African American community, where certain patterns of language or behavior are deemed lesser simply because they don't adhere to the educational norms of the white middle class. To apply Vygotsky's sociocultural theory to modern education requires instructors to take into account how students' diverse cultural experiences inform the ways in which they engage with their own education and even how they interpret and understand course content. Such mindfulness and culturally responsive teaching helps to ensure inclusion and equity within the classroom. Skinner, on the other hand, has informed my philosophies with regards to classroom management and the building of emotional competence for students with diverse learning needs. Again, via his theory of behaviorism, in which observable behaviors are conditioned. Skinner is often thought of in relation to ABA, or applied behavior analysis, as it is used often for the purposes of building emotional competency with students with autism. While ABA itself has been a source of controversy, particularly in recent years, Skinner's theories as they relate to the connection between emotional competence and academic success are important to understand for any teacher working, regardless of whether or not their students are receiving special education services. This ensures the fostering of social and emotional, as well as cognitive and academic development for their students. For the purposes of reinforcing expected and positive behavior, I use various methods such as token economy, in addition to the positive reinforcement through praise and behavioral modeling. Skinner's programmed instruction educational model also contains the principles necessary for equitable learning, these being that learners should be active, instructors should be providing immediate feedback, learning and instruction should be chunked, instructors should respect a student's self-pacing, and students should be demonstrating self-evaluation and learner verification. These models ensure that learners are engaged and involved in their education and active in the process of determining what forms of differentiation are appropriate for them and their needs. In other words, this ensures a certain level of self-determination and democratic practice. It is also through classroom management that community can be fostered. By implementing class-wide, if not school-wide, PBIS, or positive behavior interventions and supports, students are exposed to standards for behavior, collective goals, and class pride. By creating a collective classroom culture with clear and explicit expectations, goals, and norms, students develop a sense of community and cooperation with their peers, providing for more opportunities for collaboration, peer mentoring, and the use of the hive mind. One example of a way in which to do this is by coming up with a class constitution in which the class works together as a group to create a document which states the goals and expectations for all students in the class. For example, everyone will be treated with respect, students will ask questions and share ideas, students will be prepared for class, etc. Another community activity may be through a class-wide mystery motivator, where the entire class is ensured some sort of mystery reward based on how they work together and follow the class constitution, for example. Because the reward is a mystery, the problem with certain motivators not being appealing to specific students doesn't come into play, ensuring class-wide investment. While following in the footsteps of theorists such as Vygotsky and Skinner is all well and good, particularly with regards to the specifics of how I would implement specific strategies in behavior management, scaffolded instruction, etc., I've also tried to simplify my personal philosophy by identifying 5 things that I believe are required to be a quote-unquote outstanding teacher. As a lover of fantasy and adventure stories, I find it helpful for me to visualize my teaching experience as a quest in which the ultimate goal is to obtain the 5 magic keys necessary to unlock the door to outstanding teaching. So the first of these keys is equity. I believe that an outstanding teacher must always be focused on equity, ensuring that all students receive a differentiated education in which they are receiving any and all necessary supports, accommodations, and/or modifications necessary to provide that student with curricular access and opportunities for success. The key, no pun intended, is not only accounting for but breaking those obstacles that prevent students from being able to find academic success. The second magic key is adaptability. Never has it been more clear that an outstanding teacher needs to be adaptable. Not only do teachers need to be willing to adapt for the purposes of differentiating their instruction for each student's unique needs, but they need to be able to adapt to any number of sudden and often overwhelming changes and obstacles, such as we have seen this past year with virtual learning and the pandemic. The third key is engagement. Student engagement has been particularly challenging with virtual learning, but has only emphasized its importance in terms of its correlation to academic success. A teacher needs to be passionate and engaging with regards to what they are teaching, as well as devoted to building and developing relationships with their students and the larger community. Key 4 is devotion. An outstanding teacher needs to be devoted to holistically supporting their students. Teachers need to be devoted to working collaboratively with parents, families, other teachers, guidance counselors, etc., in order to create a functioning team to holistically support a student. It's all about going the extra mile to ensure that students are receiving every kind of support and encouragement, while also ensuring that students know that while self-advocacy is important, their teacher is a trusted and devoted supporter as well. Not only do teachers have a responsibility to foster academic development and growth, but social-emotional growth as well. I always make sure to include emotional check-ins as well as self-care discussions within my instruction. We know from research that a student's capacity for learning correlates with their emotional well-being. And this being the case, I think it's so crucial that we gauge our students' emotional states as a form of pre-assessment or survey-level assessment for the purpose of differentiating and altering planned instruction around the results. Taking a holistic approach to teaching ensures that students are developing into well-rounded individuals given the necessary strategies needed in life to manage both their emotional, physical, and academic well-being. And the final key is passion. This may go without saying, but teaching is hard. Teaching can be a thankless job that is too often underappreciated, underpaid, and incredibly challenging, stressful, and unpredictable. Therefore, it is crucial that a teacher truly has a passion for and loves what they do. If a teacher loves teaching, that passion for their work ensures access to the other 4 keys. So as a social studies teacher, a huge part of my philosophical framework surrounds cross-curricular or interdisciplinary teaching and assessment as a way of creating curricular access for students with different skills, interests, and abilities. I believe that social studies lends itself particularly well to this model of cross-curricular instruction for a few reasons. For one, social studies is in and of itself interdisciplinary. And what I mean by that is that encompassed within social studies are a plethora of other subjects such as sociology, psychology, civics, economics, anthropology, history, etc. Every aspect of human existence has history, and this history serves to teach us things about who we are, where we've come from, and where we're going. One might take a class on the history of math, or the history of medical science, or the history of romance literature, or art. It's all history, and therefore all social studies. Social studies is also a unique discipline in that it not only serves to impart specific content knowledge, but serves as a vehicle for the development of crucial skills that can be generalized across subject areas and transferred beyond the world of academics altogether. A proper social studies education ensures students are skilled in analysis, interpretation, discussion, critical thinking, writing, reasoning, civic engagement and responsibility, etc. Social studies is all-encompassing. So I will now talk a little bit about engagement and UDL. Because of how inherently interdisciplinary social studies is, there is a unique potential for finding creative ways to engage students with varying interests and skills, as well as for applying the tenets of UDL, such as having multiple means of engagement, representation, and expression. For example, the school in which I did my clinical internship this year is a performing arts magnet school. And over the course of the year, I found that many of my students had particular interests in areas such as art, music, performance, and other humanities. As a way of recruiting student interest and ensuring engagement, I tried to frame the history we were learning through those different lenses. A student whose strengths and interests lie in music, but who otherwise may have had no interest in learning about the Underground Railroad, may be granted more curricular access by being able to learn about the Underground Railroad via a lesson on coded spirituals. By making instruction cross-curricular, it also provides more opportunities for multiple means of representation, such as film, audio recordings, both fiction and nonfiction reading, art, and photography. Students are being exposed to content through a multitude of different modalities, ensuring curricular access for more students. With regards to assessment, I have also found that it's crucial that students are given different ways of demonstrating their content knowledge. For example, while academic writing is an important skill for students to develop, resorting to a formal paper as a summative assessment for every unit may not provide accurate data regarding the content knowledge of a student who struggles with academic writing. The student may very well have an excellent grasp of the content, but is unable to express it simply due to the means of assessment. By allowing students a certain level of freedom to utilize their own strengths and interests in demonstrating their learning, we are ensuring a more accurate collection of data that can be used for progress monitoring. So most of the research regarding cross-curricular or interdisciplinary teaching is focused on a very specific model in which different subject classes work collaboratively in creating a curricular plan. For example, students may be enrolled in a global studies program in which their English class and history class have a joint curriculum in which both classes will simultaneously focus on specific topics that relate to each other. While students are learning about the Holocaust in history class, for example, they might be reading the memoir Night in English class. I don't think that teachers should be limited, however, by the interdisciplinary programs that their school may or may not have, or by an ability to collaborate with the teachers of other disciplines. For example, in my school, there is no program such as, an English history combined program, like I explained before. And it would have been impossible to align the social studies curriculum with the curriculum of any of the other disciplines. I wouldn't expect the English class to be teaching about a book that perfectly aligned with when I was teaching about the history of that particular topic. Each subject had their own timeline and content that they needed to cover. What I've tried to do is incorporate interdisciplinary study within my social studies classes themselves by looking at history through the lenses of different disciplines such as art, music, and literature. So I will now present some examples of how I incorporated interdisciplinary instruction and assessment throughout my clinical internship. The following examples are from various lessons and assessments in which I focused on disciplines including art, literature, music, creative writing, and even fashion. Again, I chose these disciplines based off of student interests. These first few slides are from a lesson I did on Uncle Tom's Cabin as part of a unit on the Civil War. We looked at the book in terms of the message it was intended to give, as well as the power of fiction in general and the lasting legacy of this particular piece of fiction. You can see I always include little videos in my lessons as well. These next slides will show two different assessments that I created in which students would use creative writing to demonstrate their content knowledge. The first of these was the Westward Expansion Journal project, in which I asked the students to pretend that they were either a pioneer traveling westward on the Oregon Trail or a 49er traveling to California during the gold rush. I wanted them to invent a character, think about who they were traveling with, what their names were, what their background was. And I asked them to write 3 journal entries as this character. And in their first entry, they would be describing why they or their family decided to take the journey. In the second entry, they would describe what the trip was like, making reference to various primary sources that we've examined throughout the unit. And in their final entry, to describe what things were like once they arrived at their destination. And I always ask them to be specific, to use the information that we've learned throughout the unit and reference the readings we've done. The final step was to add embellishments, allowing them that bit of creativity. So, for example, maybe their character would draw sketches in their journal to accompany their entries, or they could write a poem or a song, or even a grocery list, or put a map next to their entry. I told them to be creative. The possibilities were endless. And this is where I really got to see the students shine in terms of specific skills that they had and passions that they had. The second of these assignments was used after what I had affectionately termed Lincoln Week, during which we examined Lincoln's views regarding race and slavery via a multitude of different primary sources from throughout his political career. So I asked them to pretend that they were an American living in the 1860s, and they had to write a response letter to their cousin who lives in England. This is the letter from their cousin that I created, in which she essentially is asking that you explain to her what Lincoln's views are regarding race and slavery. So these are the parameters of the assignment. The letter must answer the question, what were Abraham Lincoln's views on slavery? The letter must be at least 3 paragraphs. And they had to reference at least 3 of the primary sources that we'd examined throughout the week. I again asked them to get creative. They could include sketches, poems, songs, whatever they wanted. And then also they would have an extra credit opportunity in which they would pretend it was now 1865, post-assassination, and they could write a 1-paragraph follow-up letter to their cousin in which they reflect on how Lincoln's views seem to have evolved throughout his presidency and discuss his legacy and the effect his death would have. The following slides are from 2 lessons that I did about music. This first one was done on St. Patrick's Day, and I used Irish folk music as a way of teaching about the Irish-American experience during the Civil War. The lesson was centered on having students analyze the lyrics of the song, Paddy's Lament, in which an Irish immigrant describes his experiences coming to America only to be immediately conscripted into the Union Army and the horrors that followed. We talked about music as an important way of passing down stories and how poetry and music about people's experiences in the war were common throughout the mid to late 19th century. The second music lesson was about coded spirituals and was a part of a larger discussion on the Underground Railroad. We discussed how these songs were used to relay secret messages, and we listened to several. We then looked at the lyrics of Swing Low, Sweet Chariot and worked to decode them. These next lessons were related to art and photography. For this first one, we read about the history of the memorial sculpture of the 54th All-Black Regiment and discussed and analyzed its significance. This was part of a larger mini-unit on Black experiences and voices during the Civil War. This next lesson was all about analyzing Civil War photography. We talked about how this was the first war in which there is a photographic record, and how photography was used as a way of bringing new knowledge of the horrors of war to the everyday person. Finally is a lesson I did on the history of fashion as part of a larger current events week in which we were discussing gender expression, and sexuality. We discussed what fashion has to teach us about history and what clothes can tell us about the people who wore them and the society in which they lived. I also used it as an opportunity to express the notion that gendered fashion is pretty bogus and that what is considered masculine or feminine is completely arbitrary and constantly evolving and changing. Perhaps a bit narcissistically, I included this quote from an article I had written on the history of fashion for the museum that I work at, that I think not only sums up why studying fashion is important, but I think can be applied to a lot of the disciplines within social studies. As I said earlier, everything has history and everything is history. So why not take advantage of that fact and use students' interests in other disciplines as a way of exploring history? Of course, I included some fun videos again. So, not only did I find that I had significantly increased levels of engagement when I taught lessons such as the ones I have shown, but I had more participation from students who I otherwise would never hear from. Through cross curricular teaching and assessment, I was able to discover that my students who often don't speak or who typically don't perform well on formal assessments were in fact paying attention. And many of them had a lot of content knowledge. They just didn't have a way of expressing that knowledge or engaging with it. I gained a huge respect for the varied talents of my students, and throughout my clinical internship, I feel that I am now one step closer to unlocking that proverbial door to outstanding teacherdom. I can only hope that my philosophical framework and devotion to interdisciplinary teaching and assessment as a form of UDL will keep me on the right path as I continue my epic quest. Thank you.